Well, congratulations for making it this far. I was glad to be able to come and do this last session because I wanted to support your meeting. I think what you've been doing all week, in fact, in different locations in Europe, it is both very important and very timely. So I'm very glad to support it. It was Abraham Lincoln, of course, who said that the ballot is stronger than the bullet. We have to make sure that remains true, even though today's cyber bullets are getting harder to spot and certainly harder to stop. Ever since the end of, well, at least ever since the end of the Second World War, the foundation of transatlantic cooperation, one of the key ties that binds us so closely together, has been our shared set of fundamental values. Notably, democracy, freedom of speech, the cornerstones of our democratic processes and our democratic institutions. And as you've been discussing all week and here over the last couple of days, we have to be honest, disinformation represents a serious threat to those values, to those shared values. Today's digital tools has made spreading disinformation so much easier, cheaper, far more potentially impactful than it's been in the past. Malicious actors, both state and non-state, can and do target, spread, and amplify disinformation much more effectively than they've been able to in the past. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about the situation in Europe, how we see the challenges of disinformation and in particular electoral interference here, what we're doing about it to try and build our resilience and mitigate the risks of such interference. The first thing to say is that we clearly recognize the scale of the challenge that we're facing. The Commission's in-house cyber response team have analyzed over 30 different incidents affecting elections in various countries, outside of the EU and inside the EU. And we're acutely conscious right now that the upcoming European parliamentary elections in May, happening in at least 27 countries across a number of days, present a tempting target for anybody who wants to try and do this kind of interference. Now, disinformation, as I'm sure you've been discussing, can come and does come from various different directions. But here in Europe, as the EU's hybrid fusion cell have underlined, we do see a particular challenge from Russia and from pro-Kremlin messaging. Russia is, after all, the only country to publicly acknowledge disinformation as part of its military doctrine. Now, as I think you've been discussing, the EU is working to call out Russian disinformation for what it is. We have the East Stratcom team who've been here with you over the last couple of days, who have catalogued, analyzed, and written about nearly 5,000 pieces of pro-Kremlin disinformation since 2015. And that's helped us to improve our understanding of the tools, the techniques, indeed the intentions behind disinformation emanating from Russian sources. And their work actually offers some fascinating insights into how the Russians go about spreading some of this fake news. I've got one particular example, which one or two of you have probably heard me talk about before, so forgive me, but it's particularly striking, so I'm going to use it again. The clash in the Sea of Azov when Russia seized 3 Ukrainian naval ships and their crews. If you thought that came out of the blue, then you'd be wrong. The disinformation campaign that led up, prepared the way, started much earlier, a year earlier, when Russian media started pushing claims that the authorities in Kiev were dredging the seabed in the Sea of Azov in preparation for a NATO fleet to take up residence. Then, a little bit later, there were claims that Ukraine had infected the sea with cholera. And that was followed up a little bit later with dark mutterings in the Russian media forecasting Western-inspired provocations on the Azov Sea shore. and reporting the US had been planning for clashes between Ukrainian and Russian naval forces in the Black Sea since the 1990s. None of this was true. NATO isn't preparing to send a fleet into the Sea of Azov. The World Health Organization hadn't found any signs of cholera cases in the region, and the evidence for the supposed US plans was based on a video game a former Russian soldier had seen 15 years earlier. Some of those same tools, of course, are deployed domestically by Russia as well as externally. And that's how you get to a situation where apparently only 3% of Russians believe Moscow was in any way involved in the Skripal poisonings in the UK last year. All that said, while Russia is a major source of disinformation that we have to deal with in Europe, it isn't by any means the only one. Others are learning from their playbook, and the growing spread of disinformation poses a serious risk for our democratic processes and indeed for our wider societies. So what are we doing to counter it? Well, over the last year in particular, we've sought to have a fresh look and a clearer focus on how to tackle disinformation and the manipulation of data and behavior. And so we've called for action on longer-term challenges, such as ensuring media diversity and building critical awareness, some of the things you've just been talking about in the last panel. Indeed, we're working to improve media literacy through a series of programs, for example, promoting tools like the NewsGuard browser, which helps to give users a sense of who is behind what they're seeing, exactly one of the things that you were just talking about in the last session. But at the same time, we also need to take some shorter-term, more immediate action. So we are working to improve how we detect and call out disinformation, notably through the Stratcom work that I was just talking about and the EU Hybrid Fusion Cell. And we're working with the member states, the countries across Europe, to establish an election cooperation network, bringing together election organizers, cybersecurity, disinformation, and data protection experts to build their resilience around elections, and a new rapid alert system to map and counter organized disinformation campaigns. But above all, we need to see the internet platforms step up, and we need to see them making some real progress on this subject. They are, after all, the main vector for the spread of disinformation, including in the political space. We first called on the internet companies in April last year to take urgent action against political disinformation, and we worked with them to draw up a voluntary code of practice, which I'm sure you've referred to over the last couple of days. It took a little while to agree that. We eventually got it agreed in September, and then the platforms themselves set out the actions that they would take in key areas. So this isn't something that we imposed, it's something that we worked up together. And they said that they were going to take action to improve how political adverts are placed online, greater transparency around sponsored content, the rapid and effective identification and deletion of fake accounts, clearer rules around bots, more use of fact checkers, more effective promotion of alternative narratives, and greater openness to outside expert scrutiny. Now, just to be clear, this is absolutely not about censorship or determining if a particular piece of political content is true or false, good or bad. I agree with the comments that were just made. We shouldn't be in that business. This is about more transparency, shining a light on the provenance of the material that fuels our political debate, so that we as users, citizens, voters, have the context we need to form our own opinion about what is being said. And I think that is entirely legitimate. So we agreed on these goals with the platforms, but I'm afraid we haven't yet seen delivery. The big platforms have completed a couple of rounds of reporting so far, and I have to be honest, it leaves quite a lot to be desired. In the reporting from January, despite some progress, overall, rather than moving forward, the platforms have fallen further behind. The patchy nature of the reporting, the lack of hard data is frankly disappointing. Facebook and Twitter failed to provide the information they said they were going to provide. Google fared better in reporting on scrutiny of political ad placement, but they also failed to deliver data on how they were doing the things they'd said they would do in other areas. So we're calling on the platforms to go further and faster to meet the commitments that they signed up to under the code in order to have the necessary impact before the European elections. As someone said in another context, the clock is ticking if we're going to make the progress we need to make to build the resilience and boost confidence of participants before those elections. We'll look again in a couple of weeks at the progress when we do the reports on February, and I sincerely hope we're going to have a more positive story to tell. And given the cross-border nature of the kind of cyber-enabled threat that you've been talking about this week, our response obviously also needs to be global in reach. We're working at the EU level in some of the ways that I've described, but we also need to look beyond our own continent and our own borders, and especially, in fact, across the Atlantic. And here the role of organizations like the Atlantic Council is so important. Your events, like this one, raise awareness around disinformation, and of course, the work that you do through Digital Forensics Lab is on the front line of trying to call some of this stuff out. And from the EU side, we also support some other fora who are in this space, such as the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, and in particular the pledge on election integrity that they launched recently, which asks political parties and candidates to take it upon themselves to avoid using or benefiting from disinformation. I think that's a really powerful initiative, and I support it. So the European elections are nearly upon us, and we've got to do everything we can to protect them. But our work isn't going to end in May with those elections. Europe, in fact, is rich in elections, up to 50 over this year, if you take the national and regional ones. And frankly, across the democratic world, there is always an election going on somewhere. We have a duty to our citizens to continue to fight back against those who seek to interfere and manipulate in our elections. And the only way we're going to be able to do that successfully is by working together across Europe, across continents, to ensure that our democracies remain strong. After all, to borrow again from Abe, elections belong to the people. It's their decision. It's our job to make sure it stays that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner King. Thank you so very much.